Welcome to Pleasureology Island. I'm Freethought Steve. Thanks for stopping by. It's our second broadcast from in exile here in beautiful British Columbia. I think you could agree with me. The scenery here is fantastic. Actually, it's probably not that great here in the basement of the house, but outside in the parks and around the neighborhood, it's real beautiful. Anyway, last time I was talking about the perpetrators of the Jesus tomb robbery and how actually their scheme totally backfired on them and bit them in the butt. All right, as we recall from last time, the people who were most likely to have stolen Jesus's body from the grave, who had the means, the motive, and the opportunity to do so, were the priests in control of the Jerusalem temple, which Yeshua, the Galilean apocalyptic prophet, Yeshua had come up to announce that this temple was doomed because it was an unholy temple. It had been built by Herod the Great. It was probably built in the modern Greco-Roman style, which was probably quite offensive to the Jews. They probably left the second temple that had been constructed under the Persians pretty much intact. It had already had some improvements made to it, but Herod turned the whole outside courtyard of the temple, a huge enclosure. You could put several football fields inside that courtyard, into a big marketplace where the temple authorities licensed the people who were money lenders or money changers, because people would have to come from foreign countries, Jews that were living in the diaspora out in Asia Minor or in Egypt or in Babylonia, but when it wanted to come to Yahweh's house, Yahweh's temple in Jerusalem, where the God of the Jews actually lived, the God of the Israelites actually lived, when they wanted to come there and pay their temple tax, they had to pay the tax in shekels rather than in whatever money, denarii or whatever money the Romans and the local rulers had issued in other countries. And so the money lenders who changed, or the money changers who changed that foreign currency into temple shekels that the people could then use to pay their temple taxes, they would take a handsome profit on it. And the temple was actually a big money-making business, selling the sacrificial animals to people who wanted to sacrifice to the god Yahweh, or Yehweh, as I think it should probably be pronounced, Yehweh. Yeshua's name, in fact, was a contraction of the name of the person we know as Joshua. Joshua's name was Yehoshua. Yehoshua means Yeha saves. Yeha is salvation, Yehoshua. And then that got shortened to Yeshua, which was the name of the Galilean apocalyptic prophet who got himself crucified in Jerusalem, coming there, preaching against this temple, which had become the biggest money-making capitalist institution in Judea, and it made all the high priests rich, and their close associates and relatives all got rich off it. And so they were very heavily invested in the legitimacy of their temple, even though it wasn't the temple that Solomon originally built for Yahweh in Jerusalem. It was because that temple had been destroyed by the Babylonians in 586 BC, and it wasn't until half a century later or so that the Persians, who had replaced the Babylonians, allowed the Jews in Babylonia to return, some of them, to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple of Yahweh in Jerusalem. And so that was what's called the Second Temple. And that Second Temple had been improved down through the years, and then Herod the Great had added this huge fortress around it so that it would be someplace, if he ever got besieged by his enemies, where he could stay there for a lengthy siege and survive without being attacked, without being defeated by the rebels. There was also a Roman garrison in the corner of the temple compound. So it was a big fortress and a big place. And Herod the Great had spent 40 years building it, and actually then even more years during Jesus' lifetime. It still wasn't completed. And Yeshua comes to Jerusalem and announces that this is an unholy temple and that the high priests are not legitimate high priests, and that this temple is going to be destroyed. He doesn't say, I'm going to destroy this temple. That would have been even crazier than he actually was. He believed that Yahweh was going to destroy the temple. And he made that clear to all the people who had gathered for Passover. He said to them, you've got to repent. You've got to believe this is all going to be destroyed. And Yahweh is going to create a new, more beautiful temple. And it's going to be the true holy temple. This temple is defiled. So when the high priests, and of course the high priest himself wouldn't have come out to debate Yeshua in the temple courtyard, but he sent some of maybe the high priest's son or some of the smartest scholars of the Torah that they had to come out and challenge Yeshua and say, what authority are you doing this? Where do you get this authority saying that you're prophesying that the temple is going to be destroyed? And Yahweh says, well, where did John the Baptist get his authority? Because Yeshua said, where did John the Baptist get his authority? And the temple priests were afraid to answer, supposedly, because they thought that John the Baptist, Yohanan the Baptist, was a crazy guy, and it was good that Herod Agrippa or Herod Antipas, or whichever of the Herods it was, who had executed him. They thought that was a good thing. The temple priests did, because they thought that guy was crazy. And so, but they knew that the people had considered him a holy man and wanted to believe in his prophecy that the end of times had come. In other words, Yahweh was no longer angry at the Israelites for having worshipped, for their ancestors having worshipped false gods 500 years earlier. Yahweh was finally ready to forgive them, and when he forgave them, they would be freed from foreign oppressors. And Yohanan the Baptist had said, okay, this is the time. The time is up. We've served our sentence. And now Yahweh is going to get rid of the foreign oppressors and make a whole new kingdom, but only the people who are righteous and who have followed Yahweh and followed his laws and are pure of heart will be allowed into that kingdom. And Yahweh is going to come from the sky with an army of angels, and they're going to get rid of all the bad guys like the Romans and the Greeks and the Syrians, all the non-Jewish people, and Israel will once more be a kingdom just for the Israelites. And Yahweh was supposed to do this immediately. The time is at hand, is what John the Baptist said and what Yeshua, his disciple, said. Yeshua was continuing on the ministry of John the Baptist after John the Baptist was executed. So Yeshua comes up to the temple and he makes the mistake of refusing to acknowledge the authority of the high priest and all the chief priests at the temple. All the people are expected to kowtow down to them. The high priest is the ruler of Judea. He combines the functions of the king of Judea, even though the Roman governor is over him. But nevertheless, the high priest is over all of the Jews. And so the high priest and the other chief priests of the temple expect all the Jews to kowtow to them, to honor them, to respect them, and to do whatever they say. And here we've got Yeshua coming up, this guy from Galilee, who has no credentials whatsoever, And he's coming up here acting like a prophet. And actually, if he rides into the city on a donkey and the people are all saying, "Hail to the Son of David," that would mean that he's allowing the people to acclaim him as the new king, the king who's going to rule in the new kingdom. And it may well be that Yeshua actually believed that he was supposed to be that new king. He may have believed that he was descended from David, and his family had been hiding out in Galilee during all the period of foreign repression and foreign oppression, waiting for the time when the true Jews would be allowed to rule Judea again. So it may be that Yeshua's family had a tradition that they were descended from King David. We don't know that. It might have fed into Yeshua's delusion that he was going to go up there to Jerusalem and tell these priests off, and then Yahweh was going to send down an army of angels and get rid of all the bad people, and only the good people were going to be left, the people who were up there with Yeshua, and then Yeshua would be king, and his disciples would each of them be the judge over one of the 12 tribes of Israel, and all the tribes of Israel would be gathered back to Jerusalem and Judea. Now, I'm going into some detail on this because my point is that Yeshua, the historical Yeshua, the apocalyptic prophet, who may have thought of himself as the Messiah, the future king, was in no way like the mythological Jesus Christos, which would be the Greek version of Yeshua, the Anointed One. Jesus Christos becomes a myth and a legend in the New Testament, where he is all of a sudden now a savior whose death has paid for the sins of the people, not just the Jewish people, but the Gentiles. And he has become a savior God, and Christianity has become a Greco-Roman salvation cult, of which there were many. There was the cult of Orphism, Orpheus and Dionysius. That was one salvation cult. Another salvation cult was Isis and Osiris. There was a salvation cult of the Great Mother from Asia Minor, and other salvation cults. Mithra was a big salvation cult. And the common thing that these salvation cults were offering was the promise of an afterlife to individuals, which was a very, very different thing from what the Jewish Messiah was supposed to do. The Jewish Messiah was supposed to come for the entire people of Israel, because the entire people of Israel, back in the days of their ancestors, the entire people had sinned by worshiping other gods than Yahweh, other imaginary deities than the imaginary deity that the Israelites believed was their personal imaginary being. The Israelites believed they had a covenant, an agreement, a sacred oath, a sacred contract with this imaginary being, Yahweh. And the Israelites believed that Yahweh was the one who had given them this particular piece of land, which in fact, they had just occupied that land along with a bunch of other people and squatted in the hills and pushed out whoever was living there, and eventually formed this conglomerate group of people called the Israelites. But in fact, they had built up a legend, an origin myth of their people, saying that Yahweh, this deity from the mountains of Edom or Midian, the area around the Red City of Petra, to the southeast of the Dead Sea. This is where Yahweh came from originally, and particularly the tribe of Judah brought him with them, and he was perhaps their war leader, their imaginary war leader. And that was his primary function in the earliest times, was to give the Israelites victory in war over whoever they happened to be fighting at that moment, whether it was the Philistines or the Canaanites or the Egyptians or whoever. The function of Yahweh was to give the Israelites victory in war so they could continue to possess this little piece of land which they had settled on. And it was unfortunate that they settled on it because it was too close to the major trade routes passing between Egypt, Mesopotamia, and Asia Minor up the coast of Palestine along the seacoast there. The reason that Jerusalem survived as long as it did was that it was inland. It was not on the main trade route that ran along the coast between Egypt and Syria and the coast of Lebanon, the Phoenician cities that were sea traders on the coast of Lebanon, and then up to the Euphrates River, eastward to the Mesopotamia, and northward and west into Asia Minor. Those trade routes ran closer to the coast, and Jerusalem was kind of off the main trade route, so it wasn't so strategic that it absolutely had to be taken. Unlike the northern kingdom, which had its capital in the town of Samaria, which was much closer to the trade routes. And so when the Assyrian Empire decided to take over this whole area of the eastern Mediterranean back in the 700s BC, Assyria made sure to take the capital city of the northern kingdom, Samaria, and to capture the northern kingdom and carry off many of its people into exile in around 720 BC. And that was a pivotal event because there had been two Israelite kingdoms before that, and now there was only one, the one in the south with its capital in Jerusalem. And so many of the northern Israelites were refugees from the Assyrians, and so they fled to the south and settled there instead. And about 30 or 40 years later, Sargon II, Sennacherib. Sargon II, I think, was the one who captured Samaria, the northern kingdom. And then later on, Sennacherib, another Assyrian king, tried to capture Jerusalem, but it was so well fortified, and the king had made sure to have a good water supply for the city so they could hold out. So they were starving to death, and supposedly mothers were eating their babies. It was that bad. But finally, King Hezekiah came to an agreement with the Assyrians, paid them a huge amount of tribute, large amounts of money, and a lot of women. And the Assyrians agreed to lift their siege of Jerusalem, and they went back to Assyria, where they began to be involved in civil wars in Assyria that prevented them from ever getting back and capturing Jerusalem. So for for about a century, the southern kingdom of Judea survived, and at this point, there was a big revival. There were several revivals of belief in Yahweh, because they had two choices: either to believe that Yahweh was not strong enough to keep off the Assyrians, and he wasn't strong enough to protect the northern kingdom, and so we should stop believing in Yahweh. We should actually start believing in the Assyrian gods, because they're the ones that are winning all the wars. That would be one solution. The other solution is to double down on your belief in Yahweh and say, okay, the northern kingdom, Yahweh allowed the Assyrians to beat them because the northern kingdom was worshiping the gods of Canaan and some of the gods of Mesopotamia and some of the gods of Egypt. What happened was, when a kingdom was prosperous, and the northern kingdom was much more prosperous than the southern kingdom of Judea. The northern kingdom was closer to the cities of Phoenicia that were trading with Greece and countries all through the western Mediterranean. They had gone out and established the city of Carthage. The Phoenicians had established Carthage, and from there they were going to Spain and bringing back all kinds of things from Spain and France and Italy and all around Greece and so forth. So the Phoenician cities were wealthy merchants, and the king of Samaria, the northern kingdom, first a guy named Omri and then Ahab, they were wealthy trade partners of the Phoenicians, and they were right astride, the northern kingdom was right across the trade route that came up from Egypt, so they could collect customs duties and taxes from the people who came up that way. They were also astride the route that came up from Saudi Arabia, bringing spices up the west coast of Saudi Arabia, from the area of Yemen, and possibly some goods from India. And then there was trade coming from Asia Minor and from Mesopotamia, and all of it was being funneled through that area of northern Israel, which is why the Assyrians went ahead and made a point of capturing northern Israel and turning it into an Assyrian province. And they allowed the southern kingdom, Judea, to survive as long as they paid tribute. And what happened was, when you had a city that was involved in trade with a lot of other countries, traders and merchants from those countries would come and settle in your city, and they would want to put up a little shrine to the gods of their country. So the city of Samaria, that had a lot of foreign merchants living in it and visiting it, the city of Samaria had temples for the Canaanite gods of the Phoenician cities that were right close by. They had temples to the Mesopotamian gods, the star gods, some of them, the planetary gods, and then temples probably to the Egyptian gods for Egyptian merchants that came through. So when the northern kingdom was captured by the Assyrians, and the northern Israelite priests of Yahweh had to flee to the south to Jerusalem in that area as refugees, instead of believing that Yahweh just wasn't strong enough to protect them, they came up with this imaginary delusion that Yahweh was punishing them because they had allowed foreign gods to be worshipped on Yahweh's territory. The area of Israel was considered to be the territory of the god Yahweh, and they considered that Yahweh was a jealous God, that he didn't want any other gods in his immediate vicinity. You shall have no other gods before me, no other gods in my face that I can see in my country. That was the ideology that developed very strongly after the Assyrians conquered the northern Israelite kingdom. And so that was the ideology that motivated two revivals, two Yahwistic revivals under King Hezekiah around 680 BC, and then later under King Josiah about 60 years later, around 620 BC and after that. This revival was a purification of the whole land, supposedly, that not only were the Israelites not supposed to allow worship of any foreign gods on their country, they also were not supposed to worship Yahweh anywhere except in Yahweh's house. And Yahweh's house was that temple that Solomon had built for Yahweh in Jerusalem back around 950 BC or somewhere around there, 920, whatever. So the idea was only one place to worship Yahweh and only one God to be worshipped, Yahweh, and no other gods in the whole country. So Hezekiah did this Yahwistic revival of the religion about 680 BC. But then after Hezekiah, there was another king, a king named Manasseh, and he was saying, look, we're going to survive best if we don't isolate ourselves from the big, powerful guys, Assyria back up to the northeast, and Egypt down to the southwest. And the Phoenician, we've got to be friends with everybody and let everybody have their temples in Jerusalem, so they're all happy. And just that's our best way to survive, is to get along with everybody. Pay tribute to the Assyrians if that's what they demand, and then we'll be okay. And they were okay as long as they cooperated with everybody in a realistic manner. But then along comes this young king Josiah, who becomes king when he's just a kid. He's like 6 or 8 years old or something when his father dies, and he becomes king. And he is raised by fanatical priests of Yahweh who fill his head with this delusion right from the start. Young King Josiah is filled with the delusion that the way to keep Israel safe is to worship no other God but Yahweh, to allow no other gods in the whole country, to wipe out all the shrines and so forth. So Josiah conducts an even more severe reformation in the whole area of Judea and surrounding areas, and he sort of conquers some new areas and forces them all to worship Yahweh. He is considered the ideal king. And while he is king, one of his court historians starts to write this whole history of the Israelite people right down to his day. It's called the Deuteronomistic history because it's sort of built around the core of the book of Deuteronomy, which means the second law. This book of Deuteronomy was a second law of Moses that supposedly was found in the walls of the temple that had been hidden perhaps at the time of Hezekiah when Sennacherib was besieging Jerusalem. And they hid this scroll away that supposedly contained all of the special laws for the Jews that hadn't been observed until that time. People didn't really know about them. So this priest Hilkiah, in the time of King Josiah, around 620 BC, this priest Hilkiah finds this scroll of Deuteronomy, supposedly, in the walls of the temple somewhere hidden away, and brings it to the high priest, who then shows it to King Josiah. And King Josiah says, "Oh no, there are all these laws of Yahweh that we should have been following that we haven't been following. Oh no." And so he tears his garment as a sign of distress that they haven't been doing that. And he immediately institutes all of those laws. Everybody has to follow all of these laws that are held in the book of Deuteronomy. And so that becomes the core then of the Deuteronomistic history. The Deuteronomistic history begins with Joshua, and then Judges, 1 Kings, 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, 1 Kings, 2 Kings. This is the Deuteronomistic history, and it brings history down from the time of Joshua, Yehoshua, and Joshua supposedly made a big covenant he brought after the Israelite tribes had occupied Palestine. They formed themselves into a covenant, a group of 12 tribes, and that group of 12 tribes made a covenant with Yahweh, which was kind of like the covenant at Mount Sinai. This happens repeatedly in Israelite history. Supposedly, they have these covenant meetings where they make an agreement to all worship Yahweh and nobody but Yahweh, and to follow Yahweh's laws. And the key part of Deuteronomy, the Deuteronomistic history, and the book of Joshua is when there's a series of blessings and curses on the people of Israel that occur in that book. And the people are told that if they worship only Yahweh and they only follow Yahweh's rules, then Yahweh will bless them, and they will have great crop yields. They'll have lots of animals, lots of children, and they'll be peaceful, and everything will be good because Yahweh is blessing them and helping them, protecting them with his power. So as long as they worship only him. But If they worship other imaginary beings besides Yahweh, then Yahweh will get angry and will allow their enemies to smite them. There will be famine and plagues and hunger, and all bad things will happen to them. So this is the Deuteronomic covenant that the people of Israel began to believe very strongly about the time of King Josiah, believing very strongly that they would be blessed by Yahweh as long as they worshiped only Yahweh. And King Josiah had reformed the kingdom and gotten rid of all foreign gods and all shrines except Yahweh's house in Jerusalem. So the people were doing everything that they were supposed to be doing. And King Josiah was so intent on not letting anybody unholy pass through the country even, that when an Egyptian army wanted to pass through and go up to Assyria to help their allies in Assyria, probably fighting against the Babylonians or somebody like that, King Josiah wouldn't let the Egyptian army go through, because he said, no, this is Yahweh's land and nobody passes through, no foreign armies are allowed to pass through it. You'd be defiling our holy land here. That is our land. And so the people believed, and the Deuteronomic historian, when he wrote the Deuteronomic history, he wrote that history to show that whenever the kings of Israel had worshiped foreign gods or allowed the worship of foreign gods, then Yahweh had punished them by letting their enemies defeat them. But now we have a new King Josiah. He was like the new anointed one. He was like the Messiah one. All of the sons of David, of course, were anointed, but Josiah was kind of like, since he was the pure Yahwist or pure Yahwist, he was like the ideal Israelite king. And he was following all the rules and worshiping nobody but Yahweh. And so the people confidently expected that they would be blessed and that there would be a king of David's line on the throne in Jerusalem forever. And so that promise appears several times in the Deuteronomistic history, and the Deuteronomistic history comes to a climax, a great climax, with Josiah's reformation of the country, and now everybody's holy and everybody's happy and everything is good. And so they expected things would continue that way. But unfortunately, that was a delusion, of course, because Yahweh is an imaginary being, and Egyptian armies are real. And when Josiah told the Egyptian Pharaoh that he was not allowed to go through the country, Josiah took his army down from Jerusalem and sat across the main road coming up from Egypt and heading toward Mesopotamia. And he sat there, astride the road, waiting for the king of Egypt, saying, I'm sorry, you can't pass through here. This is Yahweh's land, and he's not letting me let anyone go through there. Well, the Egyptian Pharaoh didn't recognize Yahweh, and he did something. He either captured Josiah or defeated him in battle, but he killed Josiah, the perfect king, the king who was supposed to reign long and gloriously under Yahweh's protection. And then the Egyptian army went on up to Assyria and tried to help out the Assyrians, but didn't do a very good job. The Babylonians defeated them, and the Babylonians replaced the Assyrian Empire. And so by 598 BC, about less than probably 6 or 8 years after Josiah was killed, the Babylonian army comes down and surrounds Judea and forces Jerusalem to surrender and carries off quite a number of exiles, quite a number of the Jewish leading families into exile, and leaves a puppet king on the throne of Jerusalem. But then, unfortunately, about about 14 years later, something like that, 586 BC, maybe just 12 years later, um, the puppet king in Jerusalem makes the mistake of uh, attempting an uprising against the Babylonians, perhaps with Egyptian help. Um, but he makes the mistake of revolting against the Babylonians, and the Babylonians come on down, say, okay, fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me. And they came down and just obliterated Jerusalem, destroyed the temple completely. The temple had survived the first capture of the city by the Babylonians, but the second time they just got rid of the house of Yahweh completely. Solomon's house of Yahweh was gone. And they tore down the walls of the city of Jerusalem so that it couldn't be used as a stronghold anymore, because it was just too hard to capture that city. And they took off a bunch more people into the Babylonian exile. And at that point, somebody had to finish up the Deuteronomistic history and tell the sad story of the fact that King Josiah went out to meet the Egyptian king, but never came back, died. And then the Babylonians came and took over the country. And so evidently, they had a choice again. Do we say Yahweh is imaginary, doesn't exist at all, and we've been stupid to believe in him all this time? Or do they say, well, Yahweh was real, but he wasn't strong enough. He wasn't as strong as the Babylonian gods, so we better start worshiping the Babylonian gods instead? Or do they say, no, wait a minute, let's not blame Yahweh for letting this happen to us. It's our own fault, because King Manasseh was worshiping foreign gods 60 years ago or 80 years ago, and that's what Yahweh is punishing us for now. It's our own fault. It's the fault of the Israelite nation that we're getting punished because we didn't worship just Yahweh. And so that's why we're getting punished. And so that was the beginning of the Babylonian exile and the belief that the Israelites were going to be punished for an indefinite length of time until Yahweh was ready to forgive them and let them come back. And so there were Israelites who were still left in Israel, but there were also Israelites in Babylonia, the leading families, and they managed to keep their community together by doubling down on this idea that we're being punished for not worshiping Yahweh, instead of recognizing that they were being punished because they weren't smart enough to make alliances with the other nations around them. So they create a more deeply delusional worldview in Babylon, and they eventually have prophets who say, oh, it's all right, we're going to be saved. Yahweh is going to save us, and some of us are going to get to go back to Israel, and we'll, at some point we'll have a nation again in Israel like we did before. We'll have another kingdom there, and David will, a descendant of David will rule on the throne in that kingdom. And so this began the belief in a future Messiah that would come and restore the nation. But in the meantime, what happened was they had a different Messiah, a Messiah who wasn't even Jewish. Not only was he not the son of David, he was not even Jewish. That was Cyrus the Persian, Cyrus the Great of Persia, because he came and he overthrew the Babylonian Empire. The people who had taken the Jews from Jerusalem to Babylon, now Babylon was conquered by the Persians. And in this case, the Jews were smart. They allied themselves with the Persians, and they helped the Persians win the area of Babylonia and Babylon. And so the Persians were very friendly to the Jews. And the Jews were good warriors. the Jews, even though they'd been taken off into exile, they had been warriors for hundreds of years, and so they joined the Persian army and fought in the Persian army for the next several hundred years. There were Jewish soldiers when the Persian army invaded Greece and fought the battles of Marathon and Thermopylae and Salamis. There were Jewish warriors in those Persian armies. So the Jews and the Persians quickly became friends, and Cyrus the Great said, you can rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. I want your God, Yahweh, to be happy with me and to bless me. So please go back and rebuild your temple. And he provided funds for people to go back and start doing that. And he did that with temples all over the Persian Empire. The Persians were smart enough to know that if they kept the local people happy by letting the local people worship their own gods, then they would have a better chance of ruling a peaceful empire. So the Jews got included in this policy, and they were allowed to rebuild a temple there, and this is called the Second Temple. And that Second Temple was in existence. Cyrus defeated the Babylonians about 539 BC, and so I don't know how many years later it wasn't probably very much later. So let's say around 500 BC anyway, the temple started to be rebuilt, and somewhere around 450 BC, Ezra, a Jew from Babylonia, and some other leading families came and resettled Jerusalem again. A lot more of them came, and Ezra dedicated this temple. He read the Torah out to the people, which the Torah had meanwhile been assembled in Babylonia during this exile there. And so Ezra brought this back, and this was probably the 5 books of Moses, the Torah, that we know today to most of it was probably finished by about 450 BC. And this began the period of the Second Temple. And the idea of the people who ran the temple at that time was, yes, we're not independent. We don't have our own king. We have Persian governors over us, and that's fine. Some of the Persian governors were actually Jewish, but they were nevertheless under the jurisdiction of the local Persian satrap for that area and ultimately the Persian king of kings. So they had foreign rulers, but at least they were able to carry on the worship of Yahweh, and they were able to carry it on according to all those instructions in the book of Deuteronomy and in the Torah that Ezra read when he brought it from Babylonia and read it to the people in Jerusalem. So they set up the priesthood, and they set up the temple, and they began to sacrifice to Yahweh again, to feed him on a regular basis, which is what he liked, and keep his temple nice and clean and pure, and not let anything unholy into the temple. And as long as they did that, and as long as the other people the other Israelites followed the rules of the Torah in their own communities, whether they were living in Judea or in Babylonia or in Egypt, because there was also a large diaspora community in Egypt and probably some up in Asia Minor, because probably the Jews during the Persian Empire had spread out to the full extent of the Persian Empire, which included Egypt, included Asia Minor, and included Mesopotamia and so forth. So the priests of the Second Temple believed that Yahweh would protect the people and be happy with them as long as they could run their temple just the way that he wanted it run, according to all these rules and regulations, which of course were just written by Jewish guys trying to imagine what Yahweh would be pleased by. And they're just human imaginings, but the Jews have bought into this delusion that they have to follow all these rules and have to have all the sacrifices at Yahweh's temple just right, the house where Yahweh dwells on Mount Zion, and that was what was necessary in order to um, keep Yahweh happy with his people, the people of Israel, and maybe at some time in the future they would all be gathered back to Israel. But the people who were running the Second Temple weren't concerned about that in the future, what might happen in the future. What they were concerned about was operating the temple in the right way so that Yahweh would be happy with the food that he got from his temple and with happy with the sacrifices the people brought when they did something wrong and they had to bring an animal to sacrifice. Yahweh apparently had an insatiable appetite, and the priests were happy about that because they got to eat everything that Yahweh didn't, so they were living high. Anyway, the priests believed that they were doing the right thing. They were honoring Yahweh. But in the meantime, here comes this guy from Galilee, Yeshua, who is saying that this temple is going to be destroyed, that these aren't legitimate priests, and that this isn't, that Yahweh doesn't like the way this huge business is being run. And so he stood up against authority. And in Greek, the word stasis, to stand, a standing up, is the same word as a rebellion. And that's the way the Romans looked at it. They looked at Yeshua as he was doing a stasis. He was standing up against authority. And you didn't stand up against Roman authority, and you didn't stand up against the authority of the Jewish temple priests because the Romans had given the Jewish temple priests authority over this country. And so anyone who stood up against the Jewish temple priests was also standing up against the authority of Rome. And Rome wasn't going to have anyone standing up against them. So they agreed with the Jerusalem temple priests that this Yeshua had to be eliminated. And the temple priests said, okay, we'll take care of that. We've got our police force. We've got our tactical squad ready to go with lead clubs, no doubt bars of lead to beat people with. And they had little, probably dark lanterns that would, with a light inside the lantern, so that they could sneak down in the middle of the night from the Jerusalem temple. The Jerusalem temple was convenient because it had doors in the wall to go in and out of the city that nobody else could use. And so they used one of those doors quietly to let out this police force in the middle of the night to go across the valley of the brook Kidron to the other side to the Garden of Gethsemane. And one thing in their favor was that Passover is held at full moon. So there was plenty of moonlight by the time they went out, say 2 o'clock in the morning, when they were pretty sure everybody'd be asleep. And so the temple police could find their way by moonlight down the path across the Kidron and over to the Garden of Gethsemane, where their spies told them that Yeshua and his group were sleeping for the night. Yeshua was expecting that the next day on Passover, or the day after that on Passover, Sabbath, that Yahweh was going to send down this army of angels and miraculously get rid of the Romans, probably burn them up with the breath from his mouth, just like you see it in the book of Revelation. And it wouldn't be necessarily Yahweh himself who would do this, because he is the big king. He will sit up there in heaven, but he'll send his general, the Son of Man. And the Son of Man will come down and he'll incinerate, sort of like Godzilla. Whoosh, fiery breath will incinerate all the Romans. And what you got to do is be in the right spot there next to the Mount of Olives, huddled around Yeshua, and the good people will be saved there. And that's what Yeshua was expecting to have happen in the next day or two. But the temple police had other ideas. They grabbed him and took him back, put him through a quick trial at the Sanhedrin, first thing in the morning, probably about 6 o'clock in the morning, and accused him, of claiming to be the king, claiming to be the Messiah, claiming that he would destroy the temple and all this stuff. And, they asked him, according to the Gospels, and the Gospels, of course, nobody from Yeshua's group was actually at Yeshua's trial. Okay, so they had to make up what Yeshua was going to say. And this is, though, the climactic moment in all the Gospels, because here you get revealed the hidden secrets that about the future. This is the apocalypse. This is the revealing of the secrets about the future when Yeshua says, yeah, the temples, you're going to be destroyed. The temple's going to be destroyed. You're going to see the Son of Man coming in the clouds with glory and the armies of God. And then there's going to be a last judgment. And the good people, the sheep, are going to go to the right side. And the bad people, the goats, are going to go to the left side. And this is, I'm sure Yeshua didn't say anything like that. He probably didn't say a word to the Sanhedrin or to Pontius Pilate, because he didn't recognize that they had any authority over him. He was the representative of Yahweh, and they may have, supposedly asked him if he was the Messiah, and he might have said, yes, I am. If he really believed that, he might have said, yeah, I'm not going to deny that to you. I am the Messiah. And they said, well, what else do we need to hear? Let's take him to Pilate, who says, oh yeah, this guy's claiming to be the king of the Jews. Nobody gets to be king of the Jews unless the Romans say so. And right now, Judea is not a kingdom. It's part of a Roman province. And I, the governor, Pontius Pilate, I am the head over Judea. And so anyone who claims to be king of the Jews, he is a rebel and therefore will be executed as a rebel. And so he has him crucified. And then Joseph of Arimathea comes and bribes Pilate, basically buys Jesus's body as soon as he's dead, to take it so it won't get thrown on the garbage heap the way that an executed criminal should have had his body disposed of. But Pilate's willing to make an exception in this case, as long as he gets enough money from Joseph of Arimathea. And so he sells the body to Joseph. Joseph goes to the cross with a Roman soldier as an escort. The Roman soldier shows Pilate's note to the other soldiers who've been carrying out the execution, the crucifixions. And so they take Jesus' body down. They let Joseph of Arimathea have his two non-Jewish servants or slaves wrap Yeshua's body up, carry it off to the tomb and put it in there. And the two slaves close the tomb up. And then, as I said, it becomes, as I said last time, it becomes Sabbath evening. And so nobody can do anything. Yeshua's body's in the tomb there. It's there for 24 hours until Saturday evening. And then, because nobody can do anything that whole Sabbath day, Sabbath begins at dusk, and all day long the next day, nobody can carry out any kind of activities. You can't go defile yourself by tending to a dead body in any way. Besides, it's the high Passover service that day. That Saturday is the Sabbath day of Passover. So nobody's going to go mess with a dead body, including the priests from the temple, even though they were really pissed that Pilate had sold the body to Joseph of Arimathea, because they wanted that body totally destroyed. They didn't want the disciples to take it away and make it a shrine to Yeshua, where people could gather and talk about rebellion and about the coming kingdom, and how that temple in Jerusalem wasn't a holy temple. They didn't want Yeshua's body and his tomb to become the focus of that kind of activity. So they waited until after sundown. In fact, they probably waited until quite a while after sundown, until the moon came up. And then they went out one of those little secret doors, one of those little special doors that the temple had to go outside. And they told the doorkeeper as they went out, they were taking a donkey out and some burlap sacks and a couple of servants, a couple of slaves, non-Jewish slaves, and a couple of priests went, and they told the gatekeeper, you never saw us. You never saw us. This didn't happen. Gatekeeper says, I understand, because these two guys who were leaving, they were important priests, and they were close to the high priest. And so you didn't mess with those guys. They were in authority over you. You just said, you, the poor old gatekeeper, You might not have been a Jewish gatekeeper even. You might have been just a slave who was there, you know, who had to be the guy sitting there dozing all night by the door in case somebody wanted to go in and out. So they go out by the secret door. They go to that tomb following the moonlight. You know, they go to the tomb. The two slaves roll back, maybe they had three slaves, roll back the stone, go inside, unwrap the body to make sure they've got the right one, put it in burlap sacks or something, put it on the donkey, and take it all the way down around to the lower side of town where the city dump, where the fires are always burning down in Gehenna, the valley of the Hinnom, and have Jesus' body thrown there along with all the bones and stuff from sacrificial animals. And they probably also tell the keepers at the dump, you never saw us. If you ever say anything about us, you'll be dead. So just keep your trap shut. And they did. And so the priests went back home, went back into the temple, satisfied they had done a good night's work, and satisfactorily disposed of that Yeshua once and forever. And were they wrong? Were they ever wrong? They didn't realize that they had just opened up a whole can of worms there that was not going to go away for 2,000 years. Because when the women came up and found the empty tomb, and then all the disciples went back to Galilee and started having visions of Jesus, dreaming about Jesus, maybe even seeing him. People can have hallucinations. Our own brain can make us see things that are not actually there. It's very common because everything that we perceive is something that it's part of our consciousness. We never perceive anything that is not part of our consciousness. Much of our consciousness comes from the outside, but everything we perceive from the outside is actually reproduced in our brain. And we're not actually looking at the outside world. We're looking at a reproduction of the outside world inside our own brain, inside our consciousness. And it's easy when people are very emotionally wrought. The brain can actually make things appear in our consciousness that are not actually there. Of course, our brain does that every night when we dream. We have images in our consciousness that are not really there, but we take them for reality while we're experiencing them. So under special circumstances, the brain can also create things that appear to be really there when we're actually awake. So some people were having nighttime dreams of Yeshua, and some people were having daytime visions of Yeshua. And Paul later on claimed that he'd had one of those experiences and that made him just as much a witness to the resurrection of Yeshua as any of the people who had known him in their life, which Paul never had because he never met him. But he'd had a vision of him. He'd had a hallucination of Yeshua. And so that made him just as valid a witness to the fact that Yeshua wasn't really dead. Because when the disciples learned from the women that they had found the tomb empty, that the body was gone, then the disciples said, well, we've been having these visions and dreams of Yeshua, and the tomb was empty. Yeshua must have come back to life. He must have risen from the dead. And so they began to believe that and to start preaching that. And they thought, well, if he's risen from the dead, he's going to come back someday. And that story he was telling about the Son of Man coming in the clouds with glory, that must have been about him. He must be the one that's going to be the Son of Man. And he's going to come back, and we're going to have this fantastic kingdom, and he's going to get rid of all the Romans, and we're not going to ever have any oppressors again. And so that was the message that they started preaching. And they were preaching that, yes, Yeshua was going to be the Messiah. He was going to rule this kingdom. So the priests in Jerusalem, when the first of Yeshua's followers came back and started preaching this, the priests in Jerusalem must have been appalled because they knew the truth, that they'd gotten rid of his body. But here are these people claiming that he came back to life and that they've seen him, just like Elvis sightings, And the priests are stuck because by getting rid of his body, they'd done really an illegal thing that they shouldn't have done. They could never admit to doing that. So they couldn't tell people what the truth was. And now Yeshua's disciples were all claiming that he'd come back to life. And so all they could do was to say, well, no, no, no. Yeshua's body was stolen. He didn't come back to life. It was stolen. And it must have been those disciples that stole it, because who else would do it? So they put out the story that it was Yeshua's own disciples who'd stolen his body, when they knew very well it was they themselves who had done that. But they made them the scapegoats. But they still couldn't stop people believing it because they wanted to believe it. And that's the whole secret behind all religions, is people believe those religions because they want to, because it makes them feel better emotionally, it makes them feel safe. And particularly, once the Jesus story got transferred into the Greco-Roman world, the Greek-speaking world, basically, they were used to salvation mysteries, salvation cults, where the mistoi, the initiate, gets told secret things, and that knowledge will save them if they believe that knowledge. And so the Jesus cult, the Yeshua cult, the Jesus Christos cult, transformed salvation into an individual matter. Each individual, simply by believing that Jesus was the Messiah, that Jesus had died on the cross in order to save us from our sins. Now, that was really hardly a Jewish idea. That's an idea that comes from Orphism, that we all have original sin, and that we need somehow to be released from that in order to have eternal life. This idea of having eternal life after you die was not the original apocalyptic idea. The original apocalyptic idea of Judaism was that everybody who was alive when the Son of Man came from the sky in the clouds with the armies of angels, all the righteous people who were alive then would go into that kingdom fully alive. But then also the people, the righteous Jewish people who had followed Yahweh's commandments and believed only in Yahweh, but had died up to that point, they would all be resurrected from their graves all at once. It'd be a mass resurrection, and those people would come and join the kingdom too. But basically, salvation was for the entire people of Israel. And they didn't worry much about the non-Jews, the non-Israelites. They were going to get converted to Judaism, they were going to start worshiping Yahweh, and then they would be allowed to be part of the kingdom too, which was going to be a peaceful kingdom, never have any more wars, everything would be perfect. Okay, that was the original idea. It was a sort of national salvation after the whole nation had suffered for 500 years because of their national sin of worshiping foreign gods back in the time of King Manasseh and the other kings before him. So national sin and national salvation gets replaced in Christianity with personal sin, original sin, sin from Adam and Eve, which was really not part of the Old Testament belief at all. Original sin was a Christian invention, and they got the idea from the Orphic religion, the religion of Orpheus and Dionysius. And so original sin applies to each individual, and therefore each individual can get saved and have eternal life. Not that there's a kingdom coming back necessarily. The first few centuries, the first century or so, the Christians did still believe in that kingdom coming down to earth any minute now. But then when that didn't happen, they transferred the idea to what you get in the Gospel of John. If you look at the Gospel of John, he has no apocalyptic stuff in there at all. He has eliminated apocalypticism, and he is saying, no, you'll have eternal life when you die. Each individual will die, but will get eternal life after that if they believe in Jesus. Okay, if they have Jesus as their Savior, if they believe that Jesus paid the price for their original sin and freed them from the bondage of death. This idea in Paul that Jesus was a redeemer. A redeemer means someone who sees somebody else who's a slave and wants to set them free. So he pays the slave owner whatever the slave owner wants, feels that the slave is worth, and then the slave belongs to the person who redeemed them from slavery, and that person, if they set them free, then that person is their redeemer. That person could keep them as their slave too, and that's what Paul says about himself, that he is the doulos, the slave of Jesus Christos, because Jesus Christos bought him by dying on the cross, that somehow Jesus Christos' death on the cross paid for the supposed original sin of Paul and whoever else wants to believe in it. So my point in telling you all this story is to show you how different what Yeshua the Galilean was believing and thinking and in what he did, and how different that is from what Christianity later made the mythical Jesus Christos into. Someone who came down, was sent by God for the specific purpose of dying on the cross to pay for everybody's sins. And if you look in the Garden of Eden story, you will see that death is not the punishment of Adam and Eve, the way that Paul says. Adam and Eve were always going to die. But after they committed that sin of eating the wrong fruit, the fruit of the tree of knowledge, God said to the other members of his council, we're immortal because we've eaten from the tree of life. And you know, these people are in the habit of eating from trees that they've been told not to eat from. And so if we let them stay in the garden, they are going to eat from the tree of life too, and then they will be like us, like gods, and live forever. And we can't have that. So we're going to kick them out so they can't get at the tree of life. But we were not originally, it's not like we originally were all going to live forever and then we had that taken away by what Adam and Eve did. No. Even in the Old Testament, a book of total delusion, even in the Old Testament, everybody was going to die at some point. They never thought anybody was going to live forever. But they made up this little just so story about the Garden of Eden to explain a number of things: why children suffer why women suffer in childbirth, why men have to work so hard on the farm to grow crops, and why serpents have to crawl on their bellies. Those were the three things, because when God finds out what Adam and Eve have done in the story, he curses the serpent to crawl on his belly forever, and he curses the woman to have pain in childbirth, and he curses the man to have to work his butt off his entire life in order to grow enough crops to feed his family. So those are the curses, not the curse that now you're going to die. No. At one point, yes, Yahweh says to Adam and Eve, the day that you eat of this tree of the fruit of knowledge, that day you will die. That didn't happen. They ate of the tree of knowledge and they didn't die on that day. They kept on living. It was a false threat. Even in the legend, it was a false threat. So anyway, all right, next time I will, I don't know what I'll do. Tune in and find out. Thanks for listening. Talk to you again soon.